At this point in my life, I've had time to think about the races, not just how they ended, but what they really meant. People always ask me, Mary, who were the greatest athletes you ever saw? And it sounds like an easy question. Medals, records, times, that's what most people look at. But when you've actually stood on that line, when everything is on the edge, greatest feels different. Because it's not always about who won the most. It's about who changed something in you. The ones who made a race feel unfamiliar. The ones who forced you out of your rhythm without even touching you. Some of them beat me, some didn't. And some I only watched from a distance. But they all stayed with me. They showed me that greatness isn't just speed, it's control, timing, pressure, and the ability to take a race away from someone before they even realize it's gone. There are 5 names I still think about. Some expected, some not. But every one of them changed how I understood the sport. Let me start with someone people still talk about whenever my name comes up, Zola Budd. We weren't friends. In the Olympics, you don't really have time for that. Everything moves too fast, and everything matters too much. But I knew who she was long before we ever stood on the same track. Everyone did. There was something about her that felt different. It wasn't just the fact that she ran barefoot. People always mention that first. But what struck me was how light she looked, almost like she wasn't carrying the same weight the rest of us were carrying. When she stepped onto the track, it didn't feel loud. It didn't feel aggressive. It felt quiet. And that's what made it harder to understand. Because most of the time you can read your competition, you can see tension in their shoulders, urgency in their stride, something that tells you when they're pushing, when they're fading. But with Zola Budd, that signal never came. The problem started with her rhythm. It didn't match anything you trained for. It didn't follow the patterns you built your race around. You prepare for surges, for positioning, for contact, but you don't prepare for something that feels almost unpredictable in its calm. And that's what made it dangerous. I remember the race in Los Angeles, 1984, the 3,000 meters. Everything leading up to that moment had been building for years. Expectations, pressure, noise from outside the track that had nothing to do with running, but somehow followed us onto it anyway. And then the race started. At first it felt normal, controlled. I was where I needed to be. I knew my pace. I knew my position. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Then something shifted. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough. There was contact, a moment that didn't feel big when it happened, but it was. I lost my rhythm, just slightly. But at that level, that's all it takes. I remember thinking I could recover, that I still had control, that I could bring it back, but I couldn't, and the race kept moving without me. That's the part people don't always understand. It's not the fall itself. It's the feeling right after when everything you've built toward keeps going and you're no longer part of it. Zola Budd didn't take that race from me in a way you can measure on paper. It wasn't about strength or even speed in the traditional sense. It was about disruption. She changed the shape of the race without forcing it. And once that shape changed, I couldn't get it back. That's why I still think about her. Because some athletes beat you at the finish line. Others take the race away long before you ever get there. You don't forget races like that. But she wasn't the only one who changed how I understood a race. There was another name, one I didn't have to race to feel the impact of, Sebastian Coe. We came from different events, different systems, even different sides of the Atlantic. But in those years, if you were serious about middle distance running, you were watching him, not casually, carefully. Because what Sebastian Coe did on the track didn't look like effort, it looked like design. The first thing you noticed wasn't speed, it was control. Everything about the way he ran felt measured, almost quiet. No wasted movement, no visible panic, no moment where it looked like he was chasing the race. It always felt like the race was moving inside something he had already decided. And that's what made it unsettling. Because most of us, we respond, we adjust, we react to pace changes, to pressure, to positioning. But Coe didn't seem to react. He anticipated. The problem started with his timing. Not just when to move, but when not to. I remember watching him in those Olympic races, Moscow, then Los Angeles, the 800 meters, the 1500. Different distances, same pattern. He would sit just far enough back to stay invisible, and then at a moment that didn't look dramatic from the outside, everything would shift. No sudden explosion, no wild sprint, just a change in rhythm so precise that by the time you realized it, the race was already gone. That kind of control doesn't just come from physical ability, it comes from understanding pressure, from knowing exactly how long you can wait and how little you actually need to take everything. And for me, that was a different kind of challenge. Because you can train for speed, you can build endurance, but learning how to manage a race at that level, how to hold back without losing position, how to move without showing it, that's something else. I didn't share a starting line with Sebastian Coe in the way people expect when they think about rivalry, but I felt him anyway. In the way I thought about pacing, in the way I questioned when to move, in the way I started to realize that being strong wasn't enough if you didn't understand when strength actually mattered. He didn't just run races, he shaped them. And once you see that, once you understand that a race can be controlled before it ever becomes fast, you can't go back to thinking about it the same way again. That's what he gave me. Not a loss, not a moment you can point to on a results sheet, but a realization, and sometimes those stay with you longer than anything else. And then there was someone who showed me a completely different kind of strength, Grete Waitz. We didn't collide in the way people expect when they think about rivalry. Different distances, different types of races. But in those years, if you were paying attention, you couldn't ignore her. Because what she did didn't look dramatic. There was no sudden move that broke a race open. No moment where everything exploded and left people behind. It was quieter than that. And somehow heavier. When Grete Waitz ran, it felt like time slowed down instead of speeding up. Her stride didn't demand attention. It didn't force you to react. It just kept going. The same rhythm over and over, like something that refused to change no matter what was happening around it. And that's what made it difficult to understand. Because we're taught to think of races as moments, moves, surges, decisions that define everything in a few seconds. But she didn't build her races that way. She built them through consistency. The problem started with her refusal to break. I remember watching her in those long races, the cross-country championships, the marathons she dominated year after year. There was always a point where you expected something to happen, a dip, a hesitation, a moment where the body would finally show what it had been carrying. But it never came, not in the way you needed it to. And that creates a different kind of pressure, because when someone doesn't give you that opening, when they don't show weakness, you start to feel your own, even if you're not on the same course at that exact moment, you feel it. You start to question how long you could hold that rhythm, whether you would stay that composed if the race stretched just a little bit further than you expected. And most of the time, the honest answer isn't comfortable. That's what Grete Waitz represented to me. Not speed, not tactics in the traditional sense. Endurance as identity. The kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just stays long enough for everything else to fall away. She didn't need a final kick to win races. By the time others were thinking about making a move, she had already taken something from them, not their position, but their certainty. And once that's gone, it's hard to get anything else back. That's why I still think about her. Because some athletes don't beat you in a moment. They outlast the version of you that thought you could keep going. And when that happens, there's not much left to hold on to. And then there was a different kind of pressure altogether, the kind that didn't wait for the race to come to it. Steve Ovett. I didn't line up against him the way people expect when they think about competition. But in those years, you didn't need to share a lane with Steve Ovett to feel what he brought into a race. You could see it the moment the gun went off. Most runners are taught patience. Find your position, stay controlled, let the race develop. But Ovett didn't believe in waiting. He believed in forcing something to happen. And that changes everything. Because when someone pushes the pace early, not recklessly, but with intent, it pulls everyone else out of their plan. Suddenly you're not running your race anymore, you're reacting to his. The problem started with how early he was willing to commit. I remember watching those races, the way he would move to the front, not dramatically, not in a burst, but with this quiet insistence, like he had already decided how uncomfortable the race was going to become, and he was willing to live there longer than anyone else. That's not just physical, that's a mindset. Because once the pace lifts earlier than expected, you have to make a choice. Do you go with it and risk everything, or do you stay back and hope the race comes back to you? And most of the time, it doesn't. Ovett didn't just run fast. He created situations where hesitation cost more than effort, where waiting became the mistake. And even from a distance, that stays with you. You start to think differently about your own races, about when to move, about whether playing it safe is actually the bigger risk. He forced that question, and not in a single moment, not in one race you can point to and say, that was it. It was in the pattern, in the way he kept doing it, race after race, forcing the field into decisions they didn't want to make yet. That kind of pressure doesn't show up on a results sheet, but you feel it because it exposes something you don't always want to face, how comfortable you are with discomfort, how long you're willing to stay in a place where the race doesn't feel under control. Ovett lived there. That was his advantage. And once you understand that, once you see how a race can be taken apart before it ever reaches the final lap, you start to realize something. Sometimes the hardest athlete to face isn't the one who finishes strongest. It's the one who makes the race feel wrong from the very beginning. And finally, there was someone who showed me what it looks like when a race is already decided before it even begins. Edwin Moses. We weren't in the same event, not even close. But during that era, you couldn't be part of the Olympic world without feeling his presence. Because Edwin Moses didn't just win races, he removed uncertainty from them. The first thing you noticed wasn't his speed, it was the stillness. The way he approached the start, no wasted motion, no visible tension, nothing that suggested doubt. It felt like everything had already been settled somewhere long before he stepped onto the track. And that changes how you see competition. Because most races are built on possibility. You line up believing something can happen, that the outcome is still open. But with Moses, that feeling disappeared. The problem started with his pattern. Stride after stride, hurdle after hurdle, it never broke. Not slightly, not under pressure, not when others tried to close the gap. It was the same rhythm carried perfectly from start to finish, like something that didn't need to adjust because it had already accounted for everything. That kind of control is hard to explain unless you've lived inside a race. Because even at your best, there are moments where things feel unstable. where you have to react, correct, push a little harder than you planned. That's part of competing. But with him, there was none of that. I remember watching those races, knowing what was coming, and still feeling like there was nothing anyone could do to change it. Not because the others weren't good enough. They were. At that level, everyone is. But he didn't give you a moment. No hesitation, no opening, no space where you could believe the race might tilt your way. And when that possibility disappears, something shifts inside you. You stop thinking about winning. You start thinking about surviving the pattern. That's what made him different. It wasn't dominance in the way people usually describe it. It wasn't explosive or overwhelming. It was precise, repeatable, inevitable. He didn't race you. He erased you from the equation. And once you see that, once you understand that perfection can exist inside something as chaotic as a race, it stays with you. Because you realize sometimes the hardest opponent isn't the one who beats you. It's the one who never gives you a chance to believe you could win in the first place. Looking back now, it was never as simple as people made it sound. Not the medals, not the records, not even the races themselves. Because when you live through the Olympics, what stays with you isn't the moment you cross the line. It's everything that led up to it. The pressure you carried, the questions you didn't have answers for yet, the feeling that for a few seconds, everything you were would be exposed. Every athlete I've talked about, Zola Budd, Sebastian Coe, Grete Waitz, Steve Ovett, Edwin Moses, they didn't just represent greatness in the way people usually define it. They each showed me something I wasn't ready to see at the time. How quickly a race can change. How control can matter more than speed. How endurance isn't always visible until everything else fades. How pressure can arrive long before the final lap. And how sometimes perfection leaves no room for hope. Those lessons didn't come all at once. They came in fragments. In races I thought I understood until I didn't. And maybe that's what the Olympics really are. Not a place where you prove you're the best, but a place where you find out what part of you holds up when nothing else does. Because in the end, it was never just about who was the greatest. It was about who forced you to see yourself clearly. And once that happens, you don't go back to the way you were before.